Hello everyone and welcome to the Sleepwalker, where you'll experience eerie and spine-chilling horror stories to guide you into sleep. Before we starting, I hope you guys will leave a comment behind so we can connect each other even through a sleep. Also, if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest videos. Now, get ready to drift into sleep and let the story begin. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, just me, my best friend Jake, and the endless expanse of wilderness stretching out around us. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the pressures of city life, to disconnect from technology and find some peace in the great outdoors. The Adirondacks had always been our go-to destination, miles away from civilization, with only the trees and mountains for company. We set up camp by a small clearing near a lake, our tent pitched beside a makeshift fire pit. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and as the temperature dropped, we lit the campfire, watching the flames dance and crackle in the growing darkness. It felt like freedom, no cell service, no work emails, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional splash of water as fish leaped in the lake. Hours passed, and the fire began to die down, flickering weakly as the chill of the night set in. Jake rummaged through his bag for another log, but when he tried to reignite the flames, the fire refused to catch. It sputtered, choked, and finally went out, leaving us in near-total darkness. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and without the light of the fire, the forest around us felt impossibly vast, swallowing us in its shadow. I pulled out a flashlight, clicking it on, and felt a wave of unease as the beam cut through the darkness. Something was off. An unsettling silence had fallen over the woods. No more chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jake stood up, looking around, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes, gleaming, reflecting the light of my flashlight from just beyond the tree line. They were set wide apart, too high to belong to any normal animal. My heart skipped a beat, and I grabbed Jake's arm, pointing toward the eyes. He squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but before he could react, the eyes blinked and disappeared. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the dense underbrush and the gnarled trunks of ancient trees. Jake laughed it off, convinced it was just a deer or some other woodland creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was too absolute, too unnatural. We decided to call it a night, retreating into the tent and zipping the entrance shut. I lay there, my ears straining for any sound, but the silence persisted. Hours ticked by, and I finally began to drift off when I heard it, a faint crunching noise, like leaves being crushed underfoot. I froze, holding my breath, and the sound came again, closer this time. I reached over, nudging Jake awake, and we both listened as the footsteps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I aimed it toward the source of the sound, but the light bounced off the tent walls, unable to penetrate the darkness outside. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the blood rushing through my veins, cold and fast. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We waited, every muscle in our bodies tense, but there was only silence. Jake gestured for me to stay put as he unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. He turned to look at me, eyes wide with fear, and mouthed a single word: run. Without hesitation, we bolted from the tent, grabbing nothing but the flashlight and sprinting toward the car parked a mile down the trail. The darkness was suffocating, and I could barely see where I was going, but I could hear it behind us. The heavy, ragged breathing of something chasing us, its footsteps growing louder, faster. As we stumbled forward, I glanced back and saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs twisted and elongated, moving with an unnatural speed. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet never quite touching the ground. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment I could see its face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that burned like embers, staring right at me. We reached the car, breathless and shaking, and Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling too much to find the lock. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside, and he followed, slamming the door shut just as the figure reached us. It stood there, inches from the window, its breath fogging up the glass. I hit the lock button, and the car was filled with the deafening sound of the doors clicking shut. For a moment, everything was still. Then, it raised a hand, pressing its long, bony fingers against the window, the glass creaking under the pressure. I turned the key in the ignition, praying that the engine would start, and after what felt like an eternity, it roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning in the dirt, and we sped down the narrow trail, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The figure didn't follow. It stood there, watching us, its eyes glowing in the rearview mirror until it faded into the distance. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from our veins. We sat there in silence, trying to catch our breath, our minds racing to make sense of what had happened. As I turned off the engine, I noticed something on the windshield. 4 long, deep scratches etched into the glass, like the marks of claws. Jake reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the glass. The scratches were warm, as if they had been made just moments before. We looked at each other, and in that moment, we knew that whatever had been watching us in the woods wasn't just a figment of our imagination. It was real, and it was still out there, waiting for the next campfire to go out. It was supposed to be a weekend of adventure. My friends, Jake, Sarah, and I, decided to spend our weekend camping in the Great Smoky Mountains, far away from the noise of the city. We'd packed our bags, loaded the car, and drove deep into the mountains until the paved roads turned to gravel and the familiar landmarks disappeared. By mid-afternoon, we had reached a small clearing where we set up our tents and built a campfire. As evening fell, the forest seemed to come alive around us, the sound of rustling leaves and distant wildlife filling the air. We felt at peace, away from everything, and decided to explore the nearby woods. That's when we found it, a narrow, overgrown trail that led away from our campsite. The path was barely visible, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, as if no one had walked it in years. Curiosity got the best of us, and despite our better judgment, we decided to follow it. The trail wound through the trees, twisting and turning, the canopy above growing thicker with each step. We walked for what felt like hours, laughing and joking, until we noticed something strange. The trail was changing. The familiar landmarks, the twisted tree trunk, the large rock we'd passed, were nowhere to be seen. We tried retracing our steps, but the path was different now, narrower, the trees closer together, as if the forest itself had shifted. Panic began to set in as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the woods into darkness. Jake pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, and no matter how far we walked, we couldn't find our way back. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring our vision. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as the realization dawned. We were lost. Sarah suggested we stop and regroup, so we sat down on a fallen log, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when we heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. We froze, straining to listen, but the whisper faded, replaced by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It was getting closer. Jake stood up, shining his flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do, when the noise came again, this time from the opposite direction. We spun around, and I saw something move, a shadow darting between the trees, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, and I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We stumbled forward, our footsteps echoing in the silence, but no matter how far we went, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. The trail began to narrow, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, snagging our clothes and cutting our skin. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the light of our flashlights, and I could feel something watching us, hidden in the darkness. Jake suddenly stopped, his flashlight flickering, and pointed at something ahead. A sign, barely visible through the mist. It was old, rotting, the words etched into the wood almost completely faded, but I could just make out the warning, "Do not enter." Before we could react, the ground beneath us shifted, and I felt my stomach drop as the earth gave way, sending us tumbling down a steep slope. We hit the ground hard, my body slamming into rocks and roots as I rolled to a stop. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, and when I looked up, I realized we were no longer on the trail. We were surrounded by trees, towering over us like ancient sentinels, their branches intertwining above, blocking out the sky. I called out for Jake and Sarah, my voice echoing through the forest, and saw them standing nearby, dazed and bleeding. We tried to get our bearings, but every direction looked the same twisted trees, the same fog-shrouded ground, stretching out endlessly in all directions. Panic set in, and we started running, blindly crashing through the underbrush, hoping to find something, anything that would lead us back. That's when we saw it, a flicker of light in the distance, just beyond the trees. We ran toward it, hope swelling in our chests, and stumbled into another clearing, our hearts sinking as we realized where we were. It was our campsite, but something was wrong. The tents were torn, shredded as if by claws, and the campfire was nothing more than a smoldering pile of ash. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I felt my stomach turn as I saw it. Drag marks leading from the edge of the clearing into the darkness beyond. Jake stepped forward, his flashlight trembling, and that's when it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. It moved with an unnatural grace, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, and I felt a cold, paralyzing fear wash over me. Jake took a step back, his flashlight flickering, and the creature lunged. It moved faster than I could have imagined, its claws slicing through the air, catching Jake across the chest. He fell to the ground, blood staining the dirt, and I screamed, grabbing Sarah's arm and dragging her away. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far we went, we could still hear it, the sound of footsteps following us, growing closer with every step. We stumbled into another clearing, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, and I saw it, a wooden signpost, the same one we had passed earlier. "Do not enter." We had come full circle. The creature stepped into the clearing, its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. There was no escape. I turned to Sarah, grabbing her hand, and we took off running one last time. The fog grew thicker, the air colder, and I could feel it behind us, its breath hot against my neck, its claws brushing against my skin. I saw the trailhead in the distance, a faint glimmer of hope, and pushed forward with everything I had left. But just as we reached it, Sarah stumbled, falling to the ground. I turned back, reaching for her, and saw the creature's hand close around her ankle, dragging her into the darkness. I tried to pull her free, but its grip was too strong, and she disappeared into the fog, her scream echoing through the forest. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face, and watched as the fog lifted, revealing the path once more. I stumbled forward, my body numb, and collapsed at the trailhead, my vision fading. As I lay there, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees, I saw it, the creature, standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing in the morning light. I never saw Sarah or Jake again. I was found by a search team later that day, my clothes torn, my skin scratched and bleeding. They asked me what happened, but I couldn't find the words. All I could do was look back at the forest, at the path that had vanished without a trace, and wonder how many others had been lost to the woods. How many more would follow that hidden trail and never return? And as they led me away, I could still hear it, the faint whisper of footsteps, growing fainter with every step, but always there, always watching. The trip to Banff National Park was supposed to be an escape from the chaos of city life. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had planned this camping weekend for months, eager to immerse ourselves in the serenity of the Canadian wilderness. We'd picked a remote campsite, far from the tourist trails, surrounded by dense forest and towering mountains. It was the perfect place to disconnect and recharge. We arrived in the late afternoon, the crisp autumn air tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. After setting up our tent and gathering firewood, we sat by the campfire, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. As the darkness settled in, we shared stories and laughter, the glow of the fire flickering across our faces. By midnight, the fire began to die down, and we decided to call it a night. We crawled into our tent, zipped up the entrance, and huddled together in our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fabric offering a small comfort against the cold. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Exhausted from the day's hike, we soon drifted off to sleep. Hours later, I woke with a start. It took me a moment to remember where I was, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My heart pounded in my ears, and I lay there, listening. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves just outside the tent. My body froze, every muscle tense, as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving around the tent in a wide circle. I reached out, placing a hand on Emily's arm, and felt her stir, her breathing quickening as she too realized something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag, clicking it on, but the thin beam did little to cut through the darkness. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, ears straining for any sound, and after a moment, they started again, closer this time, circling the tent. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, cold and paralyzing, and I glanced at Emily, her eyes wide with terror. We sat there, waiting, the silence pressing down on us, until something brushed against the side of the tent. It was faint, just a light scraping, but it sent a jolt of fear through my body. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, the thin fabric of the tent barely concealing the shadow that stood just inches away. It was tall, unnaturally so, its outline distorted by the dim light. I could make out the curve of a head, the broad shoulders, and long arms that hung at its sides, the fingers tipped with something sharp. The shadow moved, and I heard it again, the faint scraping, like nails dragging across the fabric. Emily squeezed my arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and I knew we couldn't stay in the tent. We needed to get out, to run, to escape whatever was out there. I nodded to her, mouthing the words, on 3. I counted down silently, 3, 2, 1, and we unzipped the tent, bursting out into the cold night air. The flashlight beam flickered, and I caught a glimpse of it, standing just a few feet away, its face hidden in shadow, its body twisted and bent, as if it had been broken and put back together. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, wide and unblinking, and I felt a scream rise in my throat as it took a step toward us. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the branches tearing at our clothes, the ground slick with mud. I could hear Emily's ragged breathing, my own heart pounding in my ears, and behind us, the sound of footsteps, heavy, relentless, closing the distance. I risked a glance back and saw it, moving through the trees with an inhuman grace, its limbs contorting, its fingers scraping against the bark. We stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground, and I spotted a small wooden cabin at the far end, half hidden by the trees. I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward it, praying that the door would be unlocked. We reached the cabin, my fingers fumbling with the handle, and pushed it open, slamming it shut behind us. We stood there, panting, our backs pressed against the door, and listened. Silence. Then, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. I shone the flashlight around the room, revealing old, rotting furniture, the floorboards creaking under our weight. There was a window, half covered by a tattered curtain, and I crossed the room, peering out into the darkness. It was there, standing just beyond the tree line, staring at the cabin, its head tilted to one side as if listening. I watched as it took another step, then another, moving toward the cabin with an eerie, silent grace. My hands shook as I grabbed an old iron poker from the fireplace, the metal cold and heavy in my grip. I turned to Emily, her face pale, and nodded. We had to make a stand. The door shook as the creature reached it, its claws scraping against the wood, splintering it with every swipe. I stepped back, the poker raised, and braced myself as the door burst open, hanging on its hinges. It stepped inside, its head almost brushing against the ceiling, and I could finally see its face, elongated, hollow-eyed, with a mouth that stretched into a wide, toothless grin. It lunged, and I swung the poker, the metal connecting with a sickening crunch. It staggered back, a guttural growl escaping its throat, and I swung again, harder this time, feeling the bones shatter beneath the impact. It fell to the ground, its limbs twitching, and I raised the poker one last time. bringing it down with all my strength. For a moment, everything was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then, the creature twitched, its fingers curling, and I watched in horror as it began to drag itself across the floor, its eyes locked onto mine. I stepped back, slipping on the blood-slicked wood, and saw Emily grab a rusty axe from the corner of the room. She brought it down with a scream, and the creature's body went still, its eyes finally dimming. We stood there, panting, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins, and I dropped the poker, my hands shaking. We staggered out of the cabin, the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains. The forest was silent again, the air crisp and clear, and we made our way back to the campsite, our legs weak with exhaustion. The tent was still there, but it was torn, shredded as if by claws, and the fire pit was nothing more than a pile of ash. We packed up in silence, not daring to look back, and as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the creature, watching us, its head tilted to one side, its eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. We never spoke of that night again. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the darkness. The air was thick with humidity as I set up my tent deep within the Aokigahara forest, often called the Sea of Trees. I had heard countless tales about this place, most of them revolving around the eerie silence, the supernatural, and the souls said to wander through the twisted trees. But as a photographer and a thrill seeker, I wanted to experience it myself, to capture the beauty and mystery of a place that so many feared. It was late afternoon when I finished setting up my campsite, the light already starting to fade as the forest grew darker, shadows stretching across the moss-covered ground. I took out my camera, snapping shots of the ancient, gnarled trees, and the strange way their roots seemed to rise from the ground like serpents frozen in time. There was an odd stillness here, a silence that felt heavy, almost oppressive, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. As night fell, I built a small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced against the trees. I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth, but a chill lingered in the air, and every so often I thought I could hear something, a faint rustling, as if something was moving through the underbrush. I glanced around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing in from all sides. Hours passed, and the fire began to die down. I added more wood, but the flames refused to catch, flickering weakly before sputtering out. The darkness crept closer, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness, but it did little to ease the growing fear gnawing at my stomach. Then I heard it. A faint creaking sound, like branches bending under a heavy weight, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, but all I could see were the twisted trunks of trees, their bark scarred and peeling. The noise came again, closer this time, and I caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. Something tall, slender, and impossibly fast. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a tree root, and shone the light in every direction, searching for whatever was out there. The forest was still, unnaturally so, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then I saw it again. Movement, just at the edge of my vision, a shadow darting between the trees. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the spot where I had seen the shadow. The creaking grew louder, more distinct, and I realized with a jolt of fear that it wasn't just one thing moving through the trees. There were multiple figures, shifting in and out of the shadows, circling my campsite. I grabbed my camera, the lens still attached, and began to snap photos, hoping to capture whatever was out there. The flash illuminated the darkness in short, blinding bursts, and for a split second, I saw them. Tall, thin figures with limbs that bent at unnatural angles, their faces hidden beneath long, tangled hair. Their bodies were covered in ragged strips of cloth, their skin pale and cracked like dried porcelain. They stood there, frozen in the light, and I felt a scream rise in my throat as I realized they weren't human. Their eyes were empty sockets, hollow and dark, and when the light faded, they moved again, faster this time, darting from tree to tree, growing closer with every passing second. I backed up until I hit a tree, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And that's when I saw it. One of them, standing just a few feet away, its head tilted to the side, its mouth stretched into a wide, toothless grin. I raised the camera again, my hands shaking, and took another photo, the flash illuminating its face for just an instant. It was enough. I broke into a sprint, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was following me. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing in the darkness, the sound growing louder with every step. I stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight casting a faint glow across the ground, and saw a narrow path leading out of the forest. My heart leaped, and I sprinted toward it, the figures still trailing behind me, their ragged breathing filling the air. I could feel them closing in, their fingers brushing against my back, and I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The path twisted and turned, the trees growing thicker, their branches reaching out like claws. I tripped, falling to the ground, my camera skidding out of my hands, and for a moment I lay there, gasping for breath, the world spinning around me. I could hear them, just behind me, their footsteps slow, deliberate, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my camera, and took off again, the path narrowing until it was barely wide enough to walk. The figures were closer now, so close I could feel their breath on my neck, and I burst through the last line of trees, stumbling out onto a dirt road. I fell to my knees, my chest heaving, and looked back, expecting to see them, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness of the forest, silent and still. I pulled myself to my feet, my legs shaking, and walked down the road, the adrenaline slowly fading from my veins. The path led to a small ranger station, the lights flickering in the distance, and I staggered toward it, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. When I reached the door, I collapsed against it, pounding with all my strength until it opened. A ranger stood there, his eyes wide with shock, and he helped me inside, his voice a distant echo in my ears. He asked what had happened, but I couldn't find the words, couldn't explain what I had seen. All I could do was show him the photos on my camera, the images frozen in time, the figures moving through the trees, their faces twisted in silent screams. The ranger stared at the photos, his face pale, and he took a step back, muttering something in Japanese that I didn't understand. He took my camera and left the room, and I sat there, trembling, my mind replaying the events over and over. Minutes passed, then hours, and when the ranger returned, he handed me my camera, the memory card missing. He said nothing, just shook his head and pointed to the door, as if telling me to leave and never return. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the forest, the darkness swallowing the trees, and I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I got into my car, the engine sputtering to life, and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. And as I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them, the figures moving through the trees, following me, their eyes empty, their mouths stretched into that horrible, toothless grin. But there was nothing there, nothing but the darkness and the memory of footsteps, growing fainter with every mile, but always there, always watching. The rugged beauty of the Scottish Highlands had always drawn me in, its sprawling mountains, mist-covered valleys, and the eerie silence that hung over the ancient landscape. My friends, Tom and Mia, shared the same fascination, and we had planned this camping trip for months. The idea was to spend a week cut off from civilization, to experience the untouched wilderness in all its glory. We arrived in the late afternoon, choosing a spot by a small stream that ran through a dense forest. The ground was soft, covered in a thick blanket of moss, and the trees towered overhead, their branches forming a natural canopy. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing, sharing stories, and marveling at how far we were from the rest of the world. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog rolled in, wrapping around the trees like ghostly tendrils. We crawled into our sleeping bags, lulled by the crackling of the campfire, and drifted off to sleep. The night was calm, the air still, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when I woke up in the early hours of the morning, something was wrong. The fire had gone out and the fog had grown thicker, swirling around the campsite like a living thing. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and noticed them. Strange, intricate symbols carved into the trees surrounding our tents. The markings were deep, gouged into the bark, and they formed an unbroken circle around us. Each symbol was different, yet they seemed connected, part of some larger pattern I couldn't understand. I nudged Tom and Mia awake, pointing out the carvings, and saw the confusion turn to fear on their faces. We stepped outside the tents, shivering in the cold, and examined the symbols more closely. They were ancient, their edges rough as if made by something sharp and primitive. None of us recognized the markings, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. A sense of wrongness, as if they didn't belong in this world. We decided to pack up and leave, our excitement replaced by a gnawing fear that something was watching us from the shadows. But as we gathered our belongings, we heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees. I turned, shining my flashlight into the fog, and caught a glimpse of movement, something darting between the trunks, too fast to be human. Tom picked up a stick, holding it like a weapon, and gestured for us to stay close. We stood there, huddled together, our breaths visible in the cold air as the rustling grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, it stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mia took a step forward, her eyes scanning the darkness, and that's when we saw it, a figure standing just beyond the circle of trees. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and its face was hidden in shadow. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the fog, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. They stood there, just beyond the carvings, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse thudding in my ears, and I knew we had to leave. Now. We grabbed our bags, abandoning the tents, and started walking toward the trail that led out of the forest. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on us, tracking our every step. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the light of our flashlights, and the carvings seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with a sickly green light. I tried not to look at them, tried to keep my focus on the path ahead, but the symbols were burned into my mind, haunting and unrelenting. We stumbled through the darkness, the ground uneven and slick with mud, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Tom led the way, his movements frantic, but no matter how far we walked, the symbols seemed to follow us, etched into every tree we passed. It was as if the forest itself was changing, twisting, keeping us trapped in an endless loop. Mia tripped, falling to the ground, and I reached out to help her, my hands trembling. That's when I saw it, a new symbol, carved into the ground beneath her, fresh and bleeding as if it had just been made. I pulled her to her feet, and we continued moving, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They were coming from all around us now, echoing through the fog, and I felt a cold, sharp fear settle in my bones. We reached a clearing, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. The figures hadn't followed us, and I could see the faint outline of the road in the distance, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But then Tom stopped, his eyes wide with terror, and I followed his gaze. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its bark scarred and twisted, and carved into its trunk were the same symbols that surrounded our campsite. They pulsed with a sickly green light, and as I stared at them, I felt something shift, something old and powerful stirring within the tree. The ground trembled, and the tree began to move, its branches twisting and writhing like serpents. The figures emerged from the fog, surrounding us, their faces hidden beneath the shadows, and I realized with a jolt of horror that they weren't men. They were something else, something ancient, and they had been waiting for us. Tom grabbed a rock, throwing it at the figures, and they recoiled, hissing like snakes. I grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her toward the road, but as we took our first step, the ground beneath us cracked open, and I felt myself falling. We hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me, and I looked up to see the figures standing over us, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I scrambled to my feet, dragging Mia with me, and we ran. We didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't breathe until we reached the road, the fog lifting as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. We collapsed on the roadside, our bodies trembling, our minds reeling. The figures were gone, the symbols fading into nothingness, and the forest stood silent once more. We sat there, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Tom stood up, his face pale, and pointed back toward the forest. I turned, my heart skipping a beat, and saw it. Carved into the bark of a tree just beyond the road, the same symbols, glowing faintly in the morning light. We never spoke about that night again, but I see them every time I close my eyes. Those strange, haunting symbols that seem to follow us, that seem to watch us. And I know deep down that we were never meant to leave that forest. And as I drive away, I can still feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting for the next person to find their way to that hidden trail. The journey to Lake Baikal had been a dream come true. My friends Alex, Maria, and I had long been fascinated by the remote beauty of Siberia's most famous lake, the oldest and deepest in the world. We had rented a small cabin by the water's edge, far from any nearby towns, eager to experience the pristine wilderness and isolation that came with such a remote destination. The first day passed peacefully. We swam in the crystal clear water, fished for our dinner, and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As night fell, the lake turned into a mirror, reflecting the stars above, and we sat around a small campfire, sharing stories and laughing, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. By midnight, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, causing ripples to form across the surface of the lake. It seemed normal at first, just a gust of wind passing over the water. But as we prepared to head back to the cabin, something caught my eye. In the moonlight, I saw it. An unusual series of concentric ripples moving across the lake, as if something large was stirring just beneath the surface. I pointed it out to Alex and Maria, and we stood there, staring in silence as the ripples grew larger, spreading out in every direction. It didn't make sense. There was no boat, no wind strong enough to cause such movement, and yet the water continued to ripple, the circles widening, overlapping, like something was rising from the depths. A sense of unease washed over me, and I suggested we head back to the cabin. The others agreed, and we extinguished the fire, retreating to the safety of the wooden walls. But as we closed the door, I glanced back at the lake and saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark shape just beneath the surface, moving toward the shore. I locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and joined Alex and Maria by the window. We watched as the ripples grew more violent, the water churning, and then, in the moonlight, we saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reaching up from the depths, followed by another. The hands gripped the edge of the shoreline, and slowly, something began to pull itself out of the water. It wasn't human. Its skin was slick and mottled, like the scales of a fish, and its body was long and twisted, bending at unnatural angles. It dragged itself across the rocks, leaving a trail of water and slime in its wake. And as it reached the shore, it stood upright, towering over the lake with limbs that stretched impossibly long. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The creature took a step forward, its head tilting to one side, and I saw its eyes, dark, hollow, reflecting the moonlight like empty orbs. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, and let out a low, guttural hiss that sent chills down my spine. We stumbled back from the window, hearts racing, and Maria grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, her hands shaking. I tried to convince myself that we were safe inside the cabin, that the creature couldn't reach us, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It took another step and another, moving toward the cabin with a slow, deliberate pace. The wooden walls creaked as it approached, and I heard the sound of nails scraping against the wood, like claws digging in. Alex grabbed an old hunting rifle from the corner of the room, his knuckles white as he loaded a single bullet. We stood there, frozen, listening to the creature circle the cabin, its footsteps heavy and wet. Suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment I dared to hope that it had left, that it had returned to the lake. But then, without warning, the door splintered inward, and the creature lunged, its hand reaching through the opening, clawing at the air. Alex fired, the sound echoing through the cabin, and the creature recoiled, black ichor oozing from the wound. It screeched, the sound high-pitched and inhuman, and lunged again, its fingers wrapping around Alex's ankle. He screamed, thrashing against its grip, but it dragged him out of the cabin, his body disappearing into the darkness. Maria and I stood there, paralyzed with fear, and I saw the look of horror in her eyes as the creature's shadow moved across the floor, stretching toward us. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back door, and we burst out into the cold night, running for the trees. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind us, the sound of its limbs scraping against the ground, the wet squelch of its movements growing louder with every step. We reached the edge of the lake, and I glanced back, seeing the cabin in the distance, the door hanging open, the creature standing in the doorway, watching us. We had nowhere to go. The water was too deep, too dark, and the forest offered no shelter. I turned to Maria, my heart pounding, and saw the determination in her eyes. She nodded, and we ran toward the old wooden boat tied to the shore, the only chance we had left. We pushed the boat into the water, the cold seeping through my clothes, and scrambled inside, grabbing the oars and paddling with all our strength. The creature let out another screech, and I saw it move, its body slithering across the ground, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it pursued us. The boat drifted into the center of the lake, the water churning around us, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But then I felt it. The boat shuddered, rocking violently, and I looked down to see the water swirling, the dark shape rising from the depths once more. I grabbed the oar, raising it above my head, ready to strike, but the creature's hand burst through the surface, gripping the side of the boat with a force that nearly capsized us. Maria screamed, grabbing the other oar, and together we struck at the hand, the bone cracking under the impact. It released its grip, but instead of retreating, it surged upward, water cascading off its body as it loomed over us. I struck again, this time hitting its head, and it let out a roar, thrashing against the boat, sending waves crashing over the sides. Maria lost her balance, falling into the water with a splash, and I watched in horror as the creature lunged, its jaws snapping shut around her arm, pulling her under. I reached out, grabbing her other hand, but it was too strong. I saw the terror in her eyes, felt her fingers slip through mine, and then she was gone, dragged into the darkness below. I stood there, frozen, the oar still clenched in my hand, as the creature's eyes broke the surface, staring up at me. For a moment I thought it would attack again, but then it sank back into the depths, the water stilling, the ripples fading away. I sat there, drenched and shivering, the boat drifting aimlessly as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. I looked out across the water, at the calm, unbroken surface, and felt a hollow emptiness settle in my chest. Maria was gone, swallowed by the lake, and I knew I would never see her again. I paddled back to shore, my arms aching, my mind numb, and collapsed on the beach, staring out at the water. The lake was calm once more, as if nothing had happened, but as I stood there I saw it. A single ripple moving across the surface, growing larger, wider, as something stirred beneath. I turned and walked away, leaving the lake behind, knowing that it would never let me forget, that it would always be waiting, just below the surface, ready to pull me under. We set out on our hiking trip to the Black Forest, eager to explore the dense, ancient woods that had inspired countless legends and fairy tales. The plan was simple: spend a weekend hiking through the trails, camping under the stars, and enjoying the solitude that only nature could provide. My friends, Daniel, Claire, and I had been looking forward to this escape for weeks, and as we entered the forest, the excitement was palpable. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves, and the dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into soft beams that lit up the path ahead. The compass I carried hung around my neck, bouncing lightly against my chest with every step. It had always guided us reliably on our many adventures, and I had no reason to doubt it this time. By late afternoon, we had ventured deep into the forest, following a narrow, winding trail that cut through the thick underbrush. We decided to take a break, setting down our backpacks and stretching our legs. That's when I noticed it. The compass needle had stopped moving. It was stuck, pointing in one direction, no matter which way I turned. I tapped the glass, shook it, but it didn't respond. Claire laughed it off, suggesting it was just a malfunction, but I felt a knot of unease begin to form in my stomach. Daniel checked his own compass, and we exchanged a glance when he realized his had stopped working too. The air felt heavier somehow, the shadows growing longer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. We decided to retrace our steps, using the sun's position to guide us back toward the main trail. But as we walked, the trees seemed to close in around us, the path narrowing until it vanished entirely. We pushed through the thick foliage, our footsteps crunching over the fallen leaves, but no matter how far we walked, we couldn't find our way back. Panic began to set in, and I checked the compass again, hoping it would start working, but the needle remained stubbornly fixed. We tried to stay calm, reassuring each other that we would find a way out, but deep down I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that was growing in me. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog began to roll in, wrapping around the trees like smoke. We set up a small camp, building a fire to keep warm, and huddled together, hoping that morning would bring some sense of direction. But even as we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night was eerily silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire, and as I glanced into the darkness, I saw it, a flash of movement, just beyond the tree line. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it into the woods, but whatever was there had vanished. I told myself it was just an animal, that we were letting our imaginations get the better of us, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, the fog was thicker, and we set out again, trying to find the trail, but it was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. We wandered aimlessly, our footsteps growing heavier with every step, and that's when we saw them, the strange markings carved into the trees. They were deep, jagged, forming symbols that none of us recognized, and they seemed to form a path, leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, we followed the markings, hoping they would lead us out. But the further we walked, the more twisted the trees became, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sky. The air grew colder, our breaths visible in the frigid morning light, and I felt a creeping dread settle over us. We came across a clearing, and in the center stood a massive stone, weathered and cracked, with the same symbols carved into its surface. It towered over us, casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly, and as we approached, I noticed something glinting at its base, a pile of objects, scattered and broken. Daniel picked up one of the objects, and I felt my blood run cold. It was a compass, identical to ours, its needle frozen in place. We looked at each other, realization dawning, and saw more of them scattered around the stone. Compasses, watches, torn bits of clothing, all abandoned and left to rot. We turned to leave, to run, but it was too late. The shadows shifted, and I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, moving with an unnatural grace. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies twisted, and they walked with a jerking, unnatural motion, their limbs bending at impossible angles. I grabbed Daniel and Claire, pulling them toward the trees, but the figures followed, their footsteps silent, their eyes fixed on us. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how far we ran, the figures stayed close, their faces hidden in shadow. Claire stumbled, falling to the ground, and I stopped to help her, but one of the figures reached out, grabbing her by the wrist. She screamed, thrashing against its grip, but it dragged her into the darkness, her voice fading to a muffled whimper. I saw Daniel's horrified face, and we knew we couldn't help her. We turned and ran, the forest blurring around us, branches tearing at our skin. We reached a small ravine, and I saw a narrow path leading down to a river. We scrambled down the slope, the earth crumbling beneath our feet, and waded into the icy water, hoping to lose them. But as we crossed to the other side, I glanced back and saw them standing at the edge of the ravine, watching us with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. We continued down the riverbank, our legs numb, our breaths ragged, and finally we stumbled onto a dirt road, our hearts leaping with relief. We turned back one last time, and I saw the figures retreating into the trees, their forms melting into the shadows. Daniel and I collapsed on the road, gasping for breath, and I reached for the compass around my neck. The needle had begun to move again, pointing north, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. We followed the road, our steps slow and heavy, until we reached a small village on the outskirts of the forest. The locals took us in, offering us warmth and food, but when I told them what we had seen, they fell silent, their faces pale. One of the older men nodded, his eyes fixed on the forest, and whispered something in German that sent a chill down my spine. "Many have entered the Black Forest," he said, "but not all are meant to leave." We never found Claire. The authorities searched the woods for days but found no trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there. And as I looked at the compass in my hand, the needle still pointing north, I knew that whatever had taken her was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next traveler to lose their way. The idea of camping under the stars in Jasper National Park was supposed to be a thrilling escape. My friends, Mark and Sarah, and I had always loved the outdoors, and this was our chance to explore the untouched wilderness. We planned a week-long trip, equipped with tents, food, and everything we needed to make the journey unforgettable. The first 2 days passed in a blur of excitement as we hiked through dense forests, climbed rocky paths, and set up camp each night in isolated, breathtaking spots. On the third night, we found a perfect clearing by a small lake surrounded by pine trees. The water shimmered in the moonlight, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. We built a campfire, laughing and telling stories, completely unaware of what lay ahead. As the flames flickered, we crawled into our sleeping bags, exhausted but happy, and drifted off to sleep. The first scratch came just past midnight. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, a light dragging sound against the side of the tent. I dismissed it as a branch brushing against the fabric, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if something was clawing its way closer. I held my breath, straining to listen, and saw that Mark and Sarah had also stirred, their eyes wide with confusion. We exchanged nervous glances but remained silent, waiting for the noise to stop. It did, eventually, and we fell back into an uneasy sleep, telling ourselves it was just the wind. But the next night, the scratching returned. This time, it was more insistent, a rhythmic scraping that sent chills down my spine. I reached for the flashlight, shining it against the tent wall, but the sound stopped the moment the light hit the fabric. Mark unzipped the tent and peered outside, his breath misting in the cool air, but there was nothing there. No animals, no branches, nothing that could explain the noise. As he zipped the tent shut, I noticed something strange. Faint, parallel lines etched into the dirt around our campsite. They were thin, but deep, as though something had dragged its claws through the ground. We laughed it off, calling it a raccoon or some other harmless animal, but I could see the unease in Sarah's eyes. She suggested we move to another spot, but we were determined to stay, too stubborn to let our imaginations ruin the trip. On the fifth night, the scratching became worse. It circled the tent, growing louder, more frantic, like nails raking against the fabric. I could see the outline of something moving just beyond the canvas, a shadow that darted from one side of the tent to the other. My heart pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to get out, to run, but I felt paralyzed, trapped by fear. Mark grabbed the hatchet he'd brought, his hands trembling, and Sarah clutched her flashlight, her knuckles white. We waited, listening as the sound moved around us, never stopping, never pausing, until, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I thought I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the darkness. The next morning, we stepped outside to find deep scratches gouged into the tent's fabric. They weren't random. There was a pattern to them, a series of jagged lines that crisscrossed over each other, forming a symbol I didn't recognize. We packed up quickly, deciding to find another spot, but the unease followed us, clinging to our every step. That night, we camped by a cliff, hoping the open space would keep whatever was out there at bay. We built a larger fire, and Mark kept the hatchet close. Sarah stayed awake, watching the flames flicker, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Just past midnight, the scratching returned. It was more violent this time, a furious scraping that made my skin crawl. The tent shook, and I saw the fabric bulge inward, as if something was pushing against it, trying to get inside. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it at the tent wall, but the light did nothing. The scratching continued, relentless, and I could see a shape forming on the other side of the fabric. A hand, long fingers splayed out, pressing against the tent. Mark lunged forward with the hatchet, swinging wildly, and the scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, and then a low guttural growl echoed through the night. It wasn't human. It was deep, vibrating through the ground, and it sent a chill down my spine. The fire sputtered, and I saw the shadow outside retreat, slipping back into the darkness. We didn't sleep that night. We sat around the fire, weapons in hand, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, we packed up and started hiking back, desperate to leave the forest behind. But as we walked, I noticed something on the ground. More of those strange symbols, carved into the dirt, forming a trail that led deeper into the woods. Sarah was the first to spot it, a figure standing in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that hung at unnatural angles. It watched us, its head tilted to one side, and then slowly, it raised a hand, the fingers long and bony, each ending in a sharp point. Mark shouted for us to run, and we bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The sound of scratching followed us, growing louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there was chasing us. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down, didn't dare look back. We reached the cliff edge, the ground dropping away into a steep ravine, and stopped, gasping for breath. The scratching was closer now, almost deafening, and I could see the shadow moving through the trees, its form flickering in the morning light. Mark turned, his face pale, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He raised the hatchet, ready to defend us, but the creature emerged, stepping into the light. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were dark pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. It reached out, its fingers curling into claws, and lunged. Mark swung the hatchet, but the creature moved faster, its hand wrapping around his wrist with a strength that made him drop the weapon. I saw him scream, but no sound came out, his face contorted in pain as the creature dragged him toward the edge. Sarah grabbed my arm, and we stumbled back, watching in horror as the creature pushed Mark over the cliff. He fell silently, his body vanishing into the fog below, and the creature turned to face us, its head tilting to one side as if considering its next move. I felt Sarah pull me back, and we ran, not stopping until we reached the edge of the forest, where our car was parked. We scrambled inside, slamming the doors, and I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the gravel before finding traction. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us, the scratches still etched into its pale skin. We drove without stopping, without speaking, until we reached the nearest town. I pulled over, hands shaking, and we sat there, staring out at the road, trying to make sense of what had happened. The scratches were still there, etched into the sides of the car, a reminder of the nightmare we had left behind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a piece of fabric from the tent, the jagged lines still visible, and realized that no matter how far we drove, no matter where we went, we would never forget. And as I looked out at the dense, dark forest in the distance, I knew it would always be watching, waiting for the next camper to hear the scratching on their tent. The idea of exploring the rugged terrain around Loch Lomond was exhilarating. My friends, Matt and Lisa, and I were avid hikers, always chasing the next adventure. The sprawling landscapes, rolling hills, and dense woodlands of Scotland had called to us for years, and we had finally decided to spend a weekend camping in one of its most scenic spots. We trekked for hours, following a narrow trail that led us deeper into the wilderness, far from any sign of civilization. As evening approached, we stumbled upon what appeared to be an abandoned campsite tucked away between the trees. There were 3 tents, slightly collapsed, and a rusty metal fire pit in the center. Scattered around were remnants of a recent camp, a few tin cans, an old backpack, and some crumpled paper. It looked like the previous campers had left in a hurry. Lisa suggested we set up camp there, as it was getting dark, and the thought of finding another spot seemed exhausting. We rationalized that whoever had been there probably got spooked by an animal and left in a hurry. We set up our own tents and gathered around the old fire pit, trying to bring life back to the fading embers. There was a strange stillness in the air, a silence that felt unnerving. But we brushed it off as the typical eeriness that comes with camping in remote places. As the darkness thickened, I took a closer look around the abandoned site. That's when I noticed the markings. They were carved into the trees surrounding the campsite, strange, unfamiliar symbols that spiraled and twisted in erratic patterns. They seemed almost like warnings, but I told myself they were just the work of some bored campers. I pushed the unease to the back of my mind and joined my friends by the fire. The hours passed, and the chill in the air grew sharper. We were just starting to settle into our tents when we heard it, the distinct sound of something moving in the bushes nearby. We froze, listening intently, but whatever it was had gone silent. Matt shrugged it off, saying it was probably a deer, and we all tried to relax, though I could feel my heart beating faster than before. We eventually drifted off to sleep, but I woke up sometime in the night to a faint rustling sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from one of the other tents, the abandoned ones. I sat up, holding my breath, and saw a shadow moving inside one of them, the fabric shifting as if someone or something was crawling around inside. I reached out, shaking Matt and Lisa awake, gesturing toward the tent. We watched in horrified silence as the movement grew more frantic, the fabric stretching and bulging as whatever was inside tried to push its way out. Then, without warning, the tent collapsed entirely and the rustling stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Suddenly, the flap of the collapsed tent flew open, and something crawled out, something human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and its skin hung loosely from its frame, as if it had been stretched too thin. It stood there for a moment, sniffing the air, before slowly turning in our direction. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but forced it down, and Matt motioned for us to stay still. We watched as the figure moved closer, its head twitching with every step, and I saw its eyes, wide, unblinking, with dark circles around them, like something that hadn't seen light in years. It paused, tilting its head, listening, and then it turned and disappeared into the woods, moving with an eerie, jerking motion. The three of us sat there in stunned silence, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, and it was clear that leaving wasn't an option until daylight. We kept the fire going, huddled together, eyes fixed on the surrounding darkness, waiting for the first signs of dawn. But as the minutes dragged on, we heard it again, the rustling, but this time it wasn't coming from one tent. It was coming from all around us. We grabbed whatever we could as weapons, Matt wielding a heavy branch, Lisa holding a small knife, and I clutching a rock, and backed away from the campsite. The sound grew louder, and we realized that there were more of them, dozens, maybe even hundreds, moving through the woods, closing in on us. Their shapes began to emerge from the darkness, moving between the trees, figures that were once human but twisted, contorted, their skin hanging in folds, eyes wide and unseeing. They surrounded the campsite, blocking every path of escape, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, one of them lunged, and Matt swung his branch with all his strength, striking it across the head. It staggered back, letting out a raspy, gurgling sound, and the others paused as if considering their next move. For a moment, I thought we had a chance, that we might be able to fight our way out, but then they all moved at once. We were knocked to the ground, their cold, bony hands grabbing at our clothes, our hair, pulling us closer. I could hear Lisa struggling, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps, and I saw Matt being dragged toward the largest tent, his face twisted in fear. I kicked and thrashed, desperate to break free, and managed to grab the knife from Lisa's hand, slashing wildly at the figures that held me. They recoiled, their skin splitting open with every cut, but they didn't bleed. They just kept coming, their movements slow and methodical, as if they had all the time in the world. I felt a hand wrap around my ankle, pulling me toward the tent. and I drove the knife into it, again and again, until it let go. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Lisa and pulling her up, and we ran. We didn't stop, didn't look back, crashing through the underbrush, the cold air burning our lungs. I could still hear the rustling behind us, growing fainter but never stopping, always there. The sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, and I saw the edge of the forest just ahead. We burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the dirt path that led back to the main road. I turned back, expecting to see them chasing us, but they had stopped at the tree line, watching with their dark, unblinking eyes. They stood there, perfectly still, as if rooted to the spot, and then, one by one, they disappeared back into the woods, vanishing into the shadows. We made it back to the car, our bodies trembling, our minds reeling, and I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine with shaking hands. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time and saw them, standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. Matt was gone, taken by whatever had been living in that abandoned campsite. The authorities searched the area but found nothing. No tents, no strange figures, nothing but the twisted trees and the cold, empty silence of the woods. We never spoke about it again, but every time I close my eyes, I see them. The figures, standing in the darkness, their eyes wide and unblinking, waiting for the next group of campers to find that abandoned site. And every time I hear the rustling of leaves, I remember the sound of their scratching hands, dragging themselves closer, and I know that we were never meant to leave that campsite alive. The allure of camping under a canopy of stars had always drawn my friends, David, Sophie, and I, to places far from the noise of everyday life. This time we had chosen Aokigahara Forest in Japan, known for its serenity and eerie beauty. We were aware of the forest's reputation as one of the most haunted places in the world, but that only added to the thrill. We set up our campsite in a small clearing, far from any trails, with the night sky stretching above us like a blanket of diamonds. The first evening passed without incident. We cooked over a small fire, told ghost stories, and gazed up at the stars, which shone brightly through the gaps in the trees. As the temperature dropped, we zipped up our tents and fell asleep, lulled by the distant sound of the wind rustling through the branches. On the second night, something changed. I woke up to a strange, unsettling silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle with unease. I unzipped my tent, stepped outside, and looked up. The sky was pitch black. The stars, which had been so vivid the night before, had vanished without a trace. There wasn't a single pinprick of light in the sky, just a suffocating darkness that felt like it was pressing down on us. I nudged David and Sophie awake, and they emerged from their tents, blinking up at the sky in disbelief. We stood there, staring into the blackness, trying to understand what could have caused the stars to disappear so suddenly. Then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps moving slowly over the fallen leaves. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our firelight. We turned, our eyes straining to see through the darkness, but there was nothing there. David grabbed a flashlight, its beam cutting through the night, but it barely penetrated the shadows. The sound grew louder, closer, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there, watching us. Sophie suggested we move closer to the fire, and we huddled together, our backs to the flames, eyes fixed on the trees. Minutes passed, and the footsteps stopped, replaced by a new sound, the soft, deliberate scratching of something sharp against wood. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, the bark of a nearby tree, peeling away in long, thin strips, as if something was carving into it. We shone the flashlight on the tree and froze. There, etched into the bark, were strange, twisted symbols, each one more unsettling than the last. They weren't random markings. They formed a pattern, a sequence that spiraled around the trunk, growing tighter, more intricate as they moved upward. And they were fresh, the sap still oozing from the cuts. David suggested we leave, but our path back to the trailhead was now shrouded in darkness, the forest pressing in around us. We had no choice but to stay put until morning. As the hours dragged on, the fire began to burn low, and the temperature dropped even further. We added more wood, trying to keep the flames alive, but the darkness seemed to consume the light, swallowing it whole. Then we saw it, a shadow moving at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that stretched toward us, as if reaching out. It stood there, swaying slightly, watching us with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and my mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. David grabbed a burning log from the fire, holding it out like a weapon, and took a step forward, shouting at the figure to leave. For a moment, it didn't move, and I thought it might retreat. But then with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged forward, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its mouth stretching into a gaping maw lined with jagged teeth. Sophie screamed, and we scrambled backward, tripping over each other as we tried to escape. David swung the burning log, striking the figure across the chest, and it recoiled, letting out a high-pitched, inhuman screech that made my ears ring. It stumbled back into the shadows, and for a moment I thought we were safe. But then I saw them. More shadows, moving between the trees, surrounding us on all sides. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the darkness swallowing us whole. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like claws, tearing at our clothes, our skin. I heard Sophie stumble, and when I turned back, I saw one of the figures standing over her, its hand pressed against her face, its long fingers digging into her flesh. She thrashed, her eyes wide with terror, but it dragged her into the darkness, her screams fading into silence. David and I kept running, not daring to look back, not daring to stop. We reached a small ravine and scrambled down the slope, our feet slipping on the loose earth, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We found ourselves at the edge of a narrow river, its surface reflecting the blackness of the sky above, and we plunged in, hoping to lose them in the water. The cold seeped into my bones, and I felt my legs grow numb, but I kept moving, pushing forward until we reached the other side. We climbed out, collapsing onto the muddy bank, and for a moment, we lay there, gasping for breath, listening to the sound of our own heartbeats. But the silence didn't last. The scratching returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees, and I saw them. Figures moving along the riverbank, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They stopped at the water's edge, staring at us with empty, hollow expressions, and I realized with a sickening dread that they were waiting. David pulled me to my feet, and we stumbled away, moving deeper into the forest, our legs heavy, our minds numb with fear. We came to a small clearing, and in the center stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, covered in the same twisted symbols we had seen before. There was something lying on top of it, something human-shaped, wrapped in tattered cloth, its face hidden in shadow. I took a step forward, compelled by some unseen force, and reached out to touch it. The cloth fell away, revealing a skull, its mouth twisted into a permanent scream, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. David grabbed my arm, pulling me away, and we turned to leave, but it was too late. The figures had followed us. They stepped into the clearing, moving with slow, deliberate motions, their eyes fixed on the altar, on us. I felt my blood turn to ice as they surrounded us, forming a circle, trapping us in place. I looked at David, saw the fear in his eyes, and knew there was no way out. With trembling hands, he picked up a large rock and charged at the nearest figure. He struck it across the head, and it crumbled to the ground, its body dissolving into dust. But as soon as it fell, another stepped forward to take its place, and then another, until we were completely surrounded. I felt something cold wrap around my ankle, and looked down to see a hand, bony, with long, claw-like fingers, clamping onto my skin. I kicked at it, trying to break free, but more hands reached out, dragging me to the ground. I struggled, thrashing against their grip, but they were too strong, too many. I caught one last glimpse of David, still fighting, his face twisted with determination, before he was pulled under, his body vanishing beneath the swarm. And then I was falling, pulled into the darkness, the ground giving way beneath me, the world spinning out of control. I woke up to the sound of birdsong, the morning light filtering through the trees. I sat up, gasping for breath, and looked around. I was alone, lying on the forest floor, the symbols carved into the trees around me. The campsite was gone, the fire reduced to ashes, and there was no sign of David or Sophie. I staggered to my feet, my body aching, and stumbled toward the trailhead, desperate to find help. But as I reached the edge of the forest, I looked back and saw them, standing among the trees watching me, their eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. I ran, not stopping until I reached the nearest road, where I collapsed, shaking, tears streaming down my face. And as I looked up at the sky, I realized that the stars had returned, shining brightly above, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. They were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next traveler to step into the darkness. We had been planning this camping trip for months. My friends, Jason, Emma, and I needed a break from our hectic lives, and Cradle Mountain seemed like the perfect escape. Secluded, serene, and far from the noise of the city. The forest here was thick, ancient, and untouched, with trails that wound through dense underbrush, leading us deeper into isolation. We set up our camp next to a small creek, its gentle flow the only sound in the stillness of the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, cooking dinner and laughing. The sky darkened, revealing a sea of stars above us, and everything felt perfect until the silence settled in. It wasn't the calm silence we had been enjoying earlier. This was different, eerie, as if the forest itself had decided to stop breathing. Emma was the first to notice. She nudged me and pointed out into the darkness. At the edge of the firelight stood a man, his face obscured by shadows. He was tall, wearing what looked like a dark raincoat, and he didn't move. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jason stood up, calling out to him, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching us. We exchanged uneasy glances, and I could see the concern etched on Emma's face. Jason took a step forward, telling the man he was trespassing, but the stranger stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was just outside the glow of the fire. That's when he spoke. He said our names, Jason, Emma, and mine, each one rolling off his tongue with a calmness that sent a wave of terror through my body. He didn't ask who we were. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said our names as if he'd known them all along. We stood there, frozen, unable to speak. The fire crackled, and I felt a bead of sweat roll down my back despite the cool night air. Jason demanded to know who he was, but the man ignored him, his eyes shifting to Emma. He took another step forward, and I saw his face for the first time, pale, almost ghostly, with eyes that seemed to reflect the flames, hollow and empty. Emma backed away, her voice trembling as she told him to leave, but he didn't budge. He reached into his coat, and I saw the glint of something metal, a knife. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire, holding it out in front of me, my heart racing, and Jason did the same, positioning himself between Emma and the stranger. Without a word, the man lunged at Jason. I watched as the knife flashed, slicing through the air, and Jason swung his stick, catching the man across the face. The stranger stumbled back, blood dripping from a gash on his cheek, but he didn't react. He just stood there, staring at Jason with those empty eyes. Emma screamed, and the man's gaze snapped to her. He lunged again, faster this time, and I saw the blade slice through the air, heading straight for her. Instinct took over, and I tackled him to the ground, the knife skittering across the dirt. We struggled, his strength unnatural, his hands cold and rough against my skin. I felt his fingers tighten around my throat, squeezing, and my vision blurred, the edges darkening. Jason pulled him off, and the two of them rolled across the ground, the knife glinting in the moonlight. Emma grabbed it, her hands trembling, and I shouted for her to run, but she stood frozen, staring at the blood on the blade. Jason was pinned beneath the man, the stranger's hands wrapped around his neck, squeezing, and I knew I had to act. I grabbed a rock, heavy and jagged, and brought it down on the back of the stranger's head with all my strength. He collapsed, his body going limp, and Jason gasped for air, pushing him off. We stood there, panting, staring down at the man lying motionless on the ground. But then he twitched, his fingers curled, and he slowly pushed himself up, his head tilting to the side as if testing the movement. Blood dripped from the wound on his head, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized he was smiling. A wide, toothy grin that stretched across his face, as if he was enjoying this. Jason grabbed Emma's hand, and I grabbed the knife, holding it out in front of me as we backed toward the car. We hadn't noticed how far we'd strayed from the vehicle, and now it felt like miles away. The stranger stood up, dusting himself off, his eyes locked on us, and began walking forward, one slow step at a time. We broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear him behind us, his footsteps slow but deliberate, always just a few steps behind. We reached the car, Jason fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking, and I looked back, expecting to see the man right there. But he wasn't. The forest was empty, silent, the only sound our ragged breathing. We piled into the car and Jason started the engine, the tires spinning in the dirt before finding traction. As we pulled away, I looked out the back window and saw him, standing at the edge of the firelight, his head tilted, eyes following us as we drove away. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, collapsing in the safety of a small, dimly lit cafe, our bodies trembling, our minds numb. We called the police, told them what happened, but they found no sign of him. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been at our campsite at all. Jason's neck was bruised, Emma's hands were still shaking, and I couldn't get the image of his eyes out of my mind. Those hollow, empty eyes that seemed to burn with an intensity I couldn't understand. We left Tasmania the next day, and I thought I could put it behind me, forget about the stranger in the woods. But 2 weeks later, I found a piece of paper taped to my door. It was my name, scrawled in messy handwriting with a single line beneath it. I know where you are. And now, every time I walk home, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting, watching, knowing exactly who I am. The towering redwoods of Northern California had always fascinated us. My friends, Jake, Mia, and I, had planned this camping trip for months, eager to escape the bustle of city life and immerse ourselves in the ancient forest. The towering giants surrounding us made everything feel small, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods took on an eerie, yet magical quality. We set up camp in a small clearing and built a fire, the flames flickering against the trunks of the massive trees. The warmth felt comforting against the chill of the autumn night, and we huddled close, telling stories and laughing as the night grew darker. The sky was clear, the stars scattered across the night, but the dense canopy above us left only a small window to the heavens. Jake threw another log onto the fire, and we watched as the flames jumped higher, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw something strange in the way the shadows moved, like they shifted independently of the flames. I shook it off, blaming my tired eyes, and focused back on the conversation. Then it happened again. The shadow of a tree, long and thin, bent in a way that didn't make sense, almost as if it had twisted to look at us. I blinked, and it returned to its original position, swaying gently with the wind. I glanced at Mia and Jake, but they hadn't noticed anything. Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I took a deep breath and convinced myself it was nothing. The wind picked up, and the fire began to crackle louder, sending sparks into the air. That's when I saw it, the shadow of a hand, reaching out toward the fire, fingers elongated and distorted. It wasn't Jake's hand or Mia's. It moved on its own, separate from our shadows, reaching out from the darkness just beyond the light. I nudged Jake, pointing toward the shadow, and his face went pale. He grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it out like a weapon, and we all watched as the shadow hand slowly pulled back, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over us, making every hair on my neck stand on end. Mia suggested that we add more logs to the fire, thinking that a bigger flame might scare away whatever was out there. But as the fire grew brighter, the shadows only became bolder. They twisted and stretched across the ground, moving independently, shifting in ways that defied logic. I saw the shadow of a man standing among us, even though there was no one there, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Suddenly, one of the shadows broke free, darting across the ground like a snake. It slithered up the side of Jake's leg, and he jumped back, frantically trying to shake it off, but it clung to him, wrapping around his arm. He swung the burning stick at it, and for a moment, the shadow seemed to retreat, but then it lashed out, wrapping around his neck. Jake dropped to his knees, gasping, clawing at his throat, as if an invisible rope was tightening around him. Mia and I grabbed him, trying to pull him free, but our hands passed right through the shadow, unable to make contact. Jake's eyes rolled back, his face turning purple, and with one last desperate swing of the stick, the shadow released him, slipping back into the darkness. Jake collapsed, coughing, and we dragged him closer to the fire, our hearts racing, our minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. We sat there, panting, listening to the crackling of the flames, and I realized something chilling. The shadows were no longer ours. They moved around us, weaving in and out of the firelight, taking on forms that didn't belong. I saw the outline of a figure, tall and gaunt, standing behind Mia, its hand resting on her shoulder. But when I looked up, there was nothing there. She must have felt it too, because she turned to me, eyes wide with fear, and whispered that we needed to leave. Now. We grabbed our bags, stumbling over the uneven ground, but as we tried to douse the fire, the shadows moved in, closing the distance between us. Jake, still weak, fell behind, and before we could reach him, a shadow wrapped around his leg, dragging him back toward the fire. He screamed, clawing at the ground, but the shadows were relentless, pulling him closer, and then he was gone. There was no sound, no sign of him, just the dancing flames and the shadows that swirled around them. Mia and I ran, crashing through the underbrush, the light from the fire growing dimmer with every step. But no matter how far we went, the shadows followed. They slipped between the trees, their forms growing larger, more distorted, until they towered over us, blocking out the moonlight. We reached a small clearing, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But then the shadows gathered, forming a ring around us, closing in. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and I saw the terror in her eyes as she whispered that she didn't want to die. I reached for my pocket knife, gripping it so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The largest shadow lunged, and I swung wildly, the blade passing right through it. It flickered, like smoke, and for a moment, I thought it would disappear, but then it reformed, more solid, more real. It reached out, its hand wrapping around Mia's wrist, and she screamed as it pulled her into the darkness. I tried to grab her, but she was yanked away, disappearing into the shadows, her voice echoing through the trees. I stood there, panting, my chest tight, and felt the shadows close in around me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and fell to the ground, the knife slipping from my grasp. The shadows loomed over me, their forms shifting, flickering, until they took on the shapes of people I recognized. I saw Jake's face, his eyes empty and cold, his body twisted into something unrecognizable. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, but the shadows followed, always just beyond the reach of the light. I reached into my backpack, pulling out a flare, and struck it, the bright red light cutting through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, hissing, and I took a step forward, holding the flare out in front of me. They retreated, melting back into the forest, and for a moment, I thought I had won. But then I saw it. The largest shadow, standing at the edge of the clearing, its form solid, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. The flare flickered, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was burning out. I turned and ran, the darkness closing in around me, the shadows reaching out, clawing at my legs, my arms, my throat. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the flare went out, plunging me into total darkness. The last thing I saw was the shadow, bending down, reaching out to touch my face, and then, nothing. Just the sound of the fire crackling in the distance, and the rustling of leaves as the shadows melted back into the trees, leaving no trace that we had ever been there. We had been planning this camping trip for months. Aokigahara, known as the Sea of Trees, was both notorious and beautiful, and we wanted to experience the dense, mysterious woods firsthand. Despite its dark history, we thought spending a night there would be the ultimate adventure. My friends Sam, Jenna, and I were thrill seekers, always looking for the next challenge. The hike to our campsite was exhausting. We trekked through the twisted roots, under a canopy so thick it felt like twilight even at midday. When we finally found a small clearing, we set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in as the last light of day disappeared. The air grew colder as darkness enveloped the forest, and our small campfire became the only source of warmth. We joked about the legends surrounding the forest, trying to keep the mood light, even though the stories of people vanishing without a trace lingered in our minds. It was just past midnight when we heard it, the first scream. It was distant, echoing through the trees, chilling and unmistakably human. We all fell silent, straining to listen. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. It was a blood-curdling sound, filled with a terror that made my skin crawl. Jenna looked at me, her eyes wide, and I could see the fear beginning to settle in. Sam tried to laugh it off, claiming it was probably an animal, but I could tell he didn't believe it. The forest had grown eerily silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, another scream pierced the night, this time much closer, too close. Instinctively, I grabbed my flashlight and stood, my pulse racing, as I scanned the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I turned back to my friends, ready to suggest that we pack up and leave, but then we heard it, a faint rustling just beyond the reach of the firelight. The sound grew louder, and we saw movement. A figure emerged from the darkness, stumbling toward us, their face obscured by shadows. We froze, watching as they approached, their movements jerky, almost unnatural. As they stepped into the light, I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a man, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at us, his mouth moving, but no words came out. Before we could react, he collapsed to the ground, motionless. I reached out with the flashlight, and that's when I saw it. Deep gashes ran across his chest, long and jagged, as if he had been attacked by something with claws. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the dirt, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. Jenna screamed, and Sam grabbed my arm, urging us to run, but I couldn't move. I stared at the man's lifeless body, trying to comprehend what had just happened, when I noticed something else. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees to the man's body, but no tracks leading back. We weren't alone. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of more footsteps, coming from every direction. Shadows moved between the trees, closing in around us, and I saw glimpses of pale faces, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at us from the darkness. They moved closer, circling our campsite, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they had been watching us all along. Sam grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it out like a weapon, but I could see his hands shaking. Jenna clung to my arm, her nails digging into my skin as we backed away from the fire, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the whispers now, soft and urgent, like a dozen voices speaking all at once. The figures stepped into the light, and I saw them clearly for the first time. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Their eyes were hollow, and their mouths hung open, revealing rows of broken, yellowed teeth. One of them lunged forward, and Sam swung the burning stick, striking it across the face. The figure staggered back, letting out a low, guttural hiss, and the others froze, watching, waiting. Then, as if some unseen signal had been given, they all moved at once. We ran. I grabbed Jenna's hand, pulling her with me, and we sprinted through the trees, the underbrush tearing at our clothes, the screams echoing behind us. I could hear Sam's footsteps close behind, his breaths ragged, but then he cried out, and I turned just in time to see one of the figures grab him by the leg, dragging him to the ground. I wanted to help him, to go back, but Jenna pulled me forward, and we kept running, tears streaming down her face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. We stumbled through the darkness, the branches clawing at us, the sound of the figures growing louder, closer. We reached a clearing, and I saw it, a small cabin, its windows boarded up, its door hanging open. We didn't have time to think. We bolted inside, slamming the door shut, and I threw the bolt, hoping it would hold. The cabin was small, the air stale, and as I shined my flashlight around, I saw that we weren't the first to seek refuge here. Scratches covered the walls, deep gouges in the wood, and on the floor were old, dried bloodstains. Jenna collapsed against the wall, sobbing, and I stood there, my back pressed against the door, listening as the footsteps drew closer. The whispers grew louder, the words blending together, and then, silence. I waited, every muscle tense, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I heard it. a soft scratching sound like nails against wood. It was coming from the window. I turned and saw one of the figures staring in, its eyes wide, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It reached up, pressing its hand against the glass, and I saw the bloody, torn skin of its fingers, the bone poking through. The scratching grew louder, and more of them appeared, their faces pressed against the windows, watching us. Jenna crawled to the corner, curling into a ball, and I knew we had to leave. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, and we moved toward the back door. As I reached for the handle, the front door exploded inward, and they poured into the cabin, their hands outstretched, their mouths opening in unison, releasing a scream that shook the walls. I dragged Jenna through the door, and we ran into the forest, not stopping, not looking back. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they would burst, but I couldn't stop. The figures chased us, their footsteps closing in, and I knew they would catch us, that there was no way out. But then, through the trees, I saw a light, a car's headlights, cutting through the darkness. I pulled Jenna toward it, and we burst out of the forest, stumbling onto the dirt road. The car screeched to a halt, and I recognized it. Our car, the one we had left at the trailhead. I threw open the door, shoving Jenna inside, and jumped in after her, slamming the door shut. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and started the engine just as one of the figures reached the edge of the road. I hit the gas, the tires spinning on the gravel before finding traction, and we sped away, the figures fading into the darkness. We drove until the sun rose, the forest disappearing in the rearview mirror. We didn't speak, didn't look at each other, our minds numb with fear. But as we reached the highway, I saw it. Scratches running along the side of the car, deep, jagged lines that hadn't been there before. Jenna stared out the window, her eyes wide and unblinking, and I knew that we would never be the same, that the screams would follow us, echoing in our minds, no matter how far we ran. And every time I close my eyes, I see them, the figures, standing in the darkness, watching, waiting for the next camper to hear their screams. The weekend trip was meant to be an escape from the noise of our daily lives. My friends, Alex, Jamie, and I had planned to explore the wilderness of Quebec, following an adventure map and a GPS system that Alex had downloaded, promising to lead us to a secluded, undiscovered campsite deep in the forest. The drive had been long, the dirt roads rough, and as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, our GPS announced that we had reached our destination. We parked the car on a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The dense forest around us was silent, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. We unloaded our gear, eager to set up camp before darkness fell, and noticed a strange thing. There was no trail, no path indicating this spot had been used before. It was as if the forest had swallowed any signs of human presence. The GPS marked this as the right place, but something felt off. Nevertheless, we brushed off the unease, convincing ourselves that the whole point was to get away from civilization. We pitched our tents and started a fire, its warm glow flickering against the trees. We sat around it, talking and laughing, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over us since we arrived. As the night deepened, the forest grew darker, the shadows thicker. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly midnight. The GPS screen, which Alex had left on a nearby log, flickered erratically, the glowing dot that marked our location now surrounded by blank space. No roads, no trails, just an empty, uncharted void. That's when the first noise came. It was faint at first, like a distant rustling in the bushes, but it grew louder, more frantic, as if something was moving through the underbrush. Jamie pointed his flashlight toward the sound, and the beam revealed nothing but darkness. We laughed nervously, telling ourselves it was probably just an animal, but I could see the fear in Alex's eyes mirroring my own. We decided to turn in for the night, thinking that sleep would chase away the unsettling feeling that had been creeping over us. As I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt an itch on the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone's eyes are boring into you. Hours passed, and I finally drifted off, only to be jerked awake by a loud, metallic clanging. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and saw that Alex and Jamie had also emerged from their tents, eyes wide with terror. The sound came again, like metal scraping against stone, echoing through the night. We grabbed our flashlights and crept toward the source of the noise, fear tightening in our chests. There, in the middle of the clearing, we saw it. A large iron stake driven deep into the ground, chains attached to it, rattling and swinging as if they had been struck. But that wasn't the worst part. Surrounding the stake were items, pieces of jewelry, torn scraps of fabric, and faded photographs, all arranged in a circle around it. The photos showed faces, all different, all staring blankly into the camera. And as I stepped closer, I felt my blood run cold. One of the faces in the photos was Jamie. He recoiled, horror etched into his features, and stumbled back. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We need to leave." We scrambled back to the car, panic flooding our veins, but the engine refused to start. I tried again and again, turning the key until it snapped in my hand. The fuel gauge was empty, despite being full just hours ago, and the air around us grew colder, thicker, as if something was pressing down on us. We decided to head out on foot, grabbing only the essentials and leaving everything else behind. But as we moved deeper into the woods, it became clear that we weren't going anywhere. The trees all looked the same, no matter which direction we turned, and the path we thought we were following led us in circles, always back to the clearing, back to that iron stake. We set up the fire again, our breaths ragged, trying to stave off the fear gnawing at our insides. Hours passed, and we sat in silence, waiting for daylight, for something to break the oppressive darkness. But then the scratching began. It started softly, like fingernails dragging across bark, but soon it grew louder, closer, until it was right next to us. I shined my flashlight toward the noise, and that's when I saw them, figures just beyond the tree line, their faces obscured by shadows, watching us with unblinking eyes. They moved slowly, methodically, circling our campsite, and I saw something glinting in their hands, knives, rusted and jagged. We backed away, stumbling over rocks and roots, but no matter where we turned, they were there, closing in. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, my heart hammering in my chest, and we retreated to the center of the clearing, our backs to the iron stake. The fire flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the ground, and I saw Jamie clutching a large stick, ready to defend himself. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged, moving with inhuman speed, and I swung my flashlight, striking it across the face. It staggered back, and I saw it more clearly. The eyes were hollow, the skin pale and cracked, and it let out a low, guttural hiss that sent shivers down my spine. Alex grabbed a burning log from the fire, swinging it at the approaching figures, and for a moment they hesitated, retreating into the shadows. We took the chance, sprinting toward the car, but they were faster. They grabbed Jamie, dragging him back toward the stake, his screams echoing through the forest. I saw the terror in his eyes as they pulled him down, pinning him to the ground. And then, with a quick, brutal motion, one of them drove the iron stake through his chest. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from the sight. Alex pulled me by the arm, shouting at me to move, but my legs felt like lead. The figures turned their attention to us, and I saw their faces clearly for the first time. Each one of them was wearing a mask made from human skin, stitched together with thin, frayed thread. We stumbled back into the car, slamming the doors just as the first figure reached us. It slammed its fists against the windows, its expression blank and lifeless, and I grabbed the only weapon I had left, the GPS device. I hurled it at the window, the glass shattering, and Alex started the engine with a loud, desperate roar. Somehow it started. We sped away from the campsite, the tires spinning in the mud, and I looked back to see them standing in the clearing, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They didn't follow us, but I knew we would never be free of them. We made it back to the main road, bruised and battered, our minds reeling from what we had just seen. I glanced down at the GPS, its screen flickering erratically, the glowing dot that marked our location, now surrounded by nothing but darkness. We were found the next morning by a ranger, who took us back to safety. When we tried to explain what happened, no one believed us. They said we must have gotten lost, that there were no campsites in that part of the forest, that it must have been a trick of the mind. But I knew the truth. As we left that place, I saw it again, the iron stake, half buried in the ground by the side of the road, surrounded by old photographs, jewelry, and scraps of clothing. And as we drove away, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The echo of those lifeless eyes burned into my memory. We never spoke of that night again. But every time I close my eyes, I see them standing there, waiting for the next group of campers to follow their GPS to that unknown, cursed campsite. The Aokigahara forest had always intrigued me. Its dense, twisted trees and the eerie silence that seemed to shroud the area were unlike any place I'd ever been. Despite its dark history, my friends, Tom and Lucy, and I decided to spend a night camping there to experience the thrill of the unknown. We were seasoned hikers, used to challenging terrains and unsettling environments, but nothing could have prepared us for what lay ahead. The day started as any other. We parked our car at the edge of the forest, hoisted our backpacks, and followed a faint trail leading us deeper into the sea of trees. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, and even as we chatted and laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It felt as if the forest itself was listening, waiting. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing and decided to set up camp. The sun dipped behind Mount Fuji, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. We built a fire, hoping its warmth would ward off the growing chill, and tried to relax, telling stories and roasting marshmallows over the flames. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the forest around us. It muffled every sound, even the crackling of our fire, until there was nothing but an oppressive silence. The usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were absent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an all-encompassing quiet that pressed in from all sides. Then, from somewhere deep within the forest, we heard it, the faint sound of whistling. It started soft, barely audible, but grew louder, the melody slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold, and I saw Tom and Lucy exchange nervous glances. We sat there, frozen, listening as the whistling moved closer, weaving through the trees like a serpent, echoing in the still air. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it toward the source of the sound, but all I saw were the twisted, gnarled trunks of the trees. The whistling continued, circling our campsite, growing louder with each passing second. And I realized that whatever was making the sound was moving around us, watching us. Lucy whispered that it was just the wind, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she clutched her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Tom stood up, brandishing a hiking stick as if it could somehow protect us, but I could tell he was as terrified as the rest of us. Suddenly, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was even more suffocating, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. Then from the darkness, a different sound emerged, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against the bark of a tree. Tom moved toward the edge of the clearing, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but the light barely penetrated the fog. He took another step, and I saw it, a shadow, tall and slender, standing just beyond the reach of the light. It moved, jerking forward, and I heard the sound of branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot as it stepped closer. Tom swung his flashlight wildly, the beam dancing across the trees, and for a moment it caught the figure in its light. It stood motionless, watching us, its face hidden beneath a hood, its limbs long and twisted, as if they had been broken and reset in the wrong places. It raised one hand, long, bony fingers curling, and began to tap against a nearby tree, the same rhythm we had heard before. Lucy screamed, and the figure lunged forward, moving faster than anything I had ever seen. Tom tried to swing his hiking stick, but it knocked him to the ground with inhuman strength, pinning him against the dirt. I watched in horror as it leaned down, its face inches from his, and then without warning, it plunged its fingers into his chest, silencing him in an instant. I grabbed Lucy's arm, pulling her away from the campsite, and we ran. The fog seemed to thicken around us, and the trees twisted in strange, unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whistling returned, louder, more frantic, and I could feel it vibrating through the ground, the very air around us humming with its eerie tune. We stumbled through the forest, our breaths ragged, and finally reached a small cave carved into the hillside. We ducked inside, pressing ourselves against the cold stone, hoping that it would pass us by. I covered Lucy's mouth, holding her close as the whistling grew louder, the melody twisting and bending in ways that made my skin crawl. The figure appeared at the entrance of the cave, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It stepped inside, ducking its head to fit through the narrow opening, and began to tap its fingers against the cave wall, the rhythm slow and deliberate. I reached for a rock, gripping it tightly, ready to fight, but then it stopped. It stood there, motionless, and I saw its head tilt to one side as if listening. A moment passed, and then it turned and walked away, the whistling fading into the distance. We waited, hardly daring to breathe until the sound was gone. I let go of Lucy, and we stumbled out of the cave, our legs weak, our hearts racing. We found a path leading back to the main road and followed it, never looking back, until we saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. We reached the car just as the first rays of dawn broke through the fog, and I turned to look at the forest one last time. There at the tree line stood the figure, watching us, its head tilted to one side. It raised one hand, as if waving, and then it disappeared into the mist, leaving nothing but the faint echo of its whistling. We drove away, our hands shaking, our minds numb with fear. Lucy stared out the window, her eyes wide and unblinking, and I could see the terror etched into her face. We didn't speak the entire drive back to the city, and even now, weeks later, the sound of that whistling haunts me. Every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear it, a faint, melodic tune drifting through the air, growing louder, closer, until I wake in a cold sweat, certain that if I look out my window, I'll see it standing there waiting, and I know that one day I won't wake up in time.